If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that shoot 'em ups are probably one of my favorite types of games, both horizontal and vertical, with a personal preference being more towards vertical. But don't get me wrong, horizontal are just as fun. Stepping back in time to the early 90s, and the greatest video game console ever had just been released, the Super Motherfucking Nintendo. There were few games available when the console launched, and most were truly classics. Super Mario World, obviously, along with Pilot Wings, F-Zero, and a few others. One of those being the topic of this review, Gradius III. Now, while I don't consider myself some sort of Gradius expert, it is one of my favorite series. So I was surprised to learn during research for this review that Gradius III was originally released as an arcade title in Japan in 1989. It was also brought to America 2 years later in its arcade form as well, which I've never played nor never even knew about. Obviously, the main release that will be used for this review, and the version that I'm assuming most gamers know about, is the port released in 1991 on the greatest console ever released, and was a launch title for the North American release of the system as well. Let's speed off into this classic. As previously mentioned, Gradius III was released in 1991 as a launch title for the Super Motherfucking Nintendo. Now, truth be told, many of my friends who were lucky enough to get a Super Nintendo when it came out didn't get this game. They mainly had Super Mario World or F-Zero, or some even had Pilot Wings. Yeah, remember that game? Anyways, it wasn't until a few months later that we started to get Super Nintendo games in the local video rental store. And this is where we first picked up Gradius III. Wait a minute. What do I mean, Gradius III? What happened to the previous two games? That's somewhat easy to explain. Here goes. The original Gradius was an arcade game released by Konami in 1985 in Japan, and it became one of my favorite games of all time when the port was released on the original Nintendo a year later in 1986. You know what I'm talking about? However, you may be a bit confused. Why do I, and possibly you, not remember the arcade game? Well, that's because of Japan's stupid idea back in the 80s to rename games and sequels of games to something else when they were released here in North America. Thus, you probably did play Gradius, but you just didn't realize it, as the arcade version of Gradius in North America was named Nemesis. What the fuck? Why? Stupid Konami. Anyways, the original will always be awesome on the Nintendo Entertainment System. What about Gradius II? Confused again? So was I. This is because I've never played Gradius II, and I doubt many gamers in North America have. This is because Gradius II was never released in North America till... Are you ready? Till the Gradius Collection was released in 2006 on the PSP. So, yeah. It's no wonder many of us back in the early 90s were like, huh? Where did the second game go? Anyways, let's get back to Gradius III. The storyline is much the same as in other Gradius games. God damn, I miss the old Konami logo. Reminds me of greatness, and youth, and fun. And yeah, Konami, how the mighty have fucking fallen. Yeah? You take control of a starship called the Vic Viper. That doesn't totally sound 80s, does it? And your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to take on the enemy forces of the Bacterian Empire. You have a variety of weapons and shields at your disposal, as well as the ability to power them up during the course of the game, via drops from enemies. Gradius III was actually the first game in the series that allowed the player to edit their weapons and shield options before starting the game, whereas in previous titles, these were set by the programmers. So you set off on your grand adventure. The game plays in a horizontal perspective as you fly around and shoot enemy fighters, creatures, mechanical shit, as well as huge bosses. I'll get back to that a little later. Although I have always found it weird that some of your power-ups are used up just to make your ship move around at normal speed. Yes, I understand that using a speed power-up gives you an advantage over enemies. You shouldn't have to waste power-ups in the very beginning because your ship normally moves at a slug's pace. You basically just fly around and blow shit up. Enough said. Not much of a storyline, unless you want a really in-depth one that isn't mentioned anywhere in the game. This game was serious day one proof of just how much of a jump visual presentation on the Super Nintendo was, and showed what we were in store for in this new 16-bit powerhouse. Ships and enemies are nicely detailed, and the depth of colors and sprites is always nice on the eyes. We were so stoked back then, blasting off into space, destroying everything. Environments, while simple in design, work well, as they provide many different areas of the game to fly through. Some might say that things are a little too simplistic, but remember, this was a launch title. You can't be too hard on it. That's like saying a launch title for the PS2 looks like shit compared to the games that came out near the end of the console's life cycle. One of the things that has always bugged me is that many of the explosion animations are super quick, meaning there's only a few frames of animation for those events. Bosses are huge, as they normally are in many horizontal shooters, but again, they're simply animated, with just a few movements. So it does tend to detract from the overall visual effect, as opposed to other shooters of the time, like Darius Gaiden. If you look at those boss animations, they're incredibly detailed and fluidic in their design, which is why it's one of my favorites. Sounds for the most part are spot on for an early Super Nintendo title, but again, they do leave a little to be desired. Most of the sound effects are nice, but there are a few shortcomings like explosions I talked about before, except the audio this time instead of the visual. They just don't sound that full, more like blips. Some of the other sound effects are too simple or don't work that well, but they're usually overlooked when considering the game as a whole. Music doesn't suffer from this at all. The soundtrack is awesome, and is easily considered one of the greats on the Super Nintendo, not to mention in the Gradius series as well. Many of the tunes are very memorable, if albeit a little simple in their composition and their presentation. Who can forget the Stage 1 music? I mean, really? We must have heard it around 3,000 times when I was growing up. Overall, Gradius III is one of the best games on the Super Nintendo. Never mind a launch title. It was the last of the Gradius series that I played, and I still return to it now and then to play through. It was luckily included on the Super Nintendo Classic re-release, and can be played multiple ways currently. If you're looking for something complex and in-depth, you won't find it here. If you're looking for a tried and true classic horizontal shoot-'em-up from back during a time when Konami actually produced quality games and cared about their customer base, then I'd highly recommend it. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, blast off and go check it out.